I've been working with a group of auto workers, and we have been active on the question of doing something with our vacant auto plants and with our unemployed auto workers and addressing climate change. And the way we actually started is we went to Washington, D.C. as a caravan, and that's how we got the name Auto Worker Caravan. In December of '08, in the midst of the bankruptcy threats that were going on with GM and Chrysler and Ford. And our mission to go there was to speak out for rank and file auto workers and to address the crisis that was unfolding, and specifically linking it to the question of climate change and talking about redefining what these auto companies do for the future going out, especially with the government taking part ownership of these companies during the bankruptcy. So we articulated then a view that crises of major proportions also represent opportunities of major proportions. And if you want to tackle an opportunity with major proportions, you're going to need some major players.
Yeah.
You are going to need some major players. And so, although the auto workers initiated some of this activity, I certainly came to the point, and I'm going to be winning my auto worker colleagues to this view that we need a broad movement that encompasses many different social movements that are focused on one goal: to bring all these different forces with their strengths and with their outreach and with their communities into a movement that addresses multiple issues at once. That we, in the context of global warming, we don't have the luxury of just cherry picking, well, we want to deal with this issue here, we're going to deal with this issue, and we're going to leave the other issues to other people, because that's not the nature of crises. The crises, especially on the question of global warming, will not wait for us till another day.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And I can tell you that in approaching, I approached the Metro Council AFL-CIO last year in regards to this proposal. Their eyes glazed over for a couple of reasons. One, they don't know how to even deal with the question of climate change. And two, they have so many other skirmishes and fights that to add on this other one is like to, it's like to break the camel's back, so to speak. And yet, and so for example, I've been swept up in the last few weeks in this incredible crisis that we're seeing in the public sector with the threats and the challenges to collective bargaining. I spent more time in Lansing the last 2 weeks than the last 5 years because we're seeing this incredible political attack on the people of Michigan in the form of these emergency financial manager and so on. So you have all these issues that just come up in your face, and then you try to raise your hand and say, yeah, but you know what? Global warming is still a crisis, and it becomes more of a crisis with each passing day. And so it has to be put to the foreground to say that we have a major concern that's facing people globally, and it's going to take a lot of hands to address it. So the item that got put together, I had a lot to do with this here, this CONVERGE to convert, was that it first of all talks about accentuating and documenting that, for example, the last 10 years, the last decade, has been the hottest for the globe in human record. And that means something. We have to address that. And that in terms of the human component of contributing carbon emissions and so on, that we have to act to responsibly and consider that the industry that has made Detroit so great is contributing 20% of those carbon emissions to this global problem. So that's number one. Number two, that in the meantime, so that what that would require is, first of all, reduced energy consumption. It requires different energy consumption, a different mode of living in regards to energy. And that, coupled with the crisis that is looming in regards to the growing scarcity of oil for the globe, that the idea that we're going to continue producing automobiles as a mode of transportation for the 21st century is just mistaken. We can't conceive that that's what we're going to do from here on out, so that instead we should be redefining the role of Detroit as a transportation center for 21st century transportation. Never mind the production of windmills, energy components, and so on. And so that, given that, for example, the city of Detroit has 50% unemployment, and you know what the state, massive state unemployment, and that this predicament that we're in is going to be lasting for a good while. I don't hear anybody saying that we're going to reduce this unemployment anytime soon. That this is going to deepen the crisis for all of us here, and one way to address it is to take these mothball factories and to re-employ a very skilled industrial workforce in those factories to produce the things that we need for the 21st century. And that addresses the question of climate change, and it begins to address the question of employment, especially in a sector that has had a strong tradition of industrial work. The people that are laid off are not clerks, they're producers, they make things. So, we fashioned an argument, a little bit controversial, around this concept of arsenal of democracy. But the reason we pull that out is to point out that in this country's history, in this city's history, we have seen an unbelievably rapid conversion if the political will existed to do it. And that's what the case was in 1940, when all these forces got together and said, yeah, we need to produce all this war material, we stopped producing cars. You can't get a 1943 Oldsmobile because they never made one, right? Yeah. And within 8 months, this became the so-called arsenal of democracy. And the reason we bring it up now is not so much because we want to talk about war preparations. On the contrary, we want to talk about a different kind of war, and that is a war to slow down the global climate change. Now, it's very interesting, and Al and I have had some conversation about this. At the point, so we said, well, maybe we can call it Arsenal of Democracy 2.0. It's fashionable, right? Yeah. So I checked on the web and did some browsing, and I wonder if anybody's using Arsenal of Democracy 2.0. And lo and behold, I found something that uses, it's called Detroit's premier business journal, Deep Business, and it had an article last year called Arsenal of Democracy 2.0. Bingo, bingo. They said, oh, I wonder what they're talking about. Well, guess what? They're not talking about exactly what I'm talking about. They're talking about making a military center out of this region.
Unfortunately, in Macomb County.
Oh, in Macomb County.
Yeah. And calling it an arsenal of democracy. Yeah.
And I can give, exactly. And I can give you little pieces out of this article, and I can send it to you by email. I have a couple of copies here, just to give you a flavor. But there's a problem as more and more Michigan firms find work in the auto industry drying up. They're increasingly looking to defense. Okay, and to a lesser extent, Homeland Security. We're swamped with companies seeking military contracts. Today, the federal government spends as much as $800 billion. The true number is classified on defense. About $4 billion comes to Michigan. In the Macomb-St. Clair region alone, about $300 million in military contracts were awarded in fiscal 2008. Not surprisingly, the state of Michigan is strongly encouraging more defense work. The group stressed the concentration of industries and the huge pool of highly skilled workers available in Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. We expect, so this gives you the flavor of, there are other planners that are planning a future for this region. And what I would think would be an unmitigated disaster is to make this region dependent on future wars and more wars for our livelihood.
We're too dependent already. Our new CEO of Macomb County Democrats, whose name escapes me at the moment, I usually know it, but whenever I want to say it, it's not there. But he calls Macomb County the capital of defense here in Michigan. The defense capital of Michigan, if not the country. That was wonderful too.
So that's-
And then there was this was in the Macomb and the Warren Weekly about a month ago, and then the Free Press carried another article, and there were all these tanks, etc. And in my city that I'm always semi-ashamed of anyway, Warren is where they want to build a lot of this stuff. So what the hell do I do about that?
Yeah, and Reagan Democrats turned things
Yeah,
around
right,
30 years ago, so deja vu of
Yeah.
Macomb County's,
right.
leading the parade downhill.
So if you understand where I'm going, where I'm going is to say, I've already identified that auto workers have an interest in doing something about conversion, that certainly all the peace activists, anti-war activists, don't want to see the militarization of the region, would like to, if those facilities are going to be used, they're going to be used for something else. And certainly addressing climate change is a means to peace, because we know that climate change is going to create just the opposite as people begin to migrate out of regions in the world that are no longer economically viable to regions that are, and with competition of resources and so on, that's just wars from here on out over resources and migration. So, and along with that, and going with the question of transportation and the growing scarcity of oil, is that we have to go to a new transportation mode, because there's going to be a lot of people in this region that are not going to be able to afford to drive little individual cars with the fuel prices that they are, et cetera, and that we need new forms of public transit. So there's a transportation connection, which brings in not only auto workers but transportation unions, and it begins to broaden the field, and it also broadens the field in terms of social justice, because transportation is a social justice issue, and it's going to become more so as the years as we go forward. And so anyway, this proposal, which was proposed a year ago, it doesn't have a date on it, unfortunately, was a proposal for a May Day event. And the idea was to show up at the Maroons deserted Michigan Railway Depot, and to have had a demonstration there to talk about what's happened to our transit, what's happened to our public transportation, and then to walk a mile to connect with the Immigrant Rights March, which would have been happening the same day, and linking the question of immigration to the question of climate change and transportation. So you begin to tie a lot of different constituencies into a common focus and begin to have collaborative relationships. Well, needless to say, this didn't happen last year. People were overwhelmed trying to organize a U.S. Social Forum. And so the auto workers were involved in the convention of the UAW last summer. We just recently, today, concluded our convention for bargaining. So I pulled this off the shelf and I say, I'm bringing this to you. And what I think may be something that I would propose is that it would be lovely to plan for a May 1st action a year from now. And by the way, the other obvious thing is, how does it tie into May 1st, aside from the Immigrant Rights March? I don't think there's any question that you can't fix global warming over the skies in the U.S. without doing it in France, without doing it in Mexico, and without doing it in South Africa. It's got to be a global effort. And May 1st was, in fact, a global effort, because it was Workers of the World Unite.
Workers' Day, yeah.
So the idea is that this really, we know that there are global communities all over the world that are addressing the same problem, and it's something that in the long term that would be valuable to connect and say, this is a global fight for all of us. So, and then